All right, so today we will learn 4 to 5 new different ways of modeling something. This will be the first project that we will do, and that one will already contain the biggest chunk of what we will learn today. We will have 2 different techniques, and we will also learn how we can build a studio setup. We use then the same studio setup for the other renders. For this example, it looks not so interesting, a little bit lame and plain. I should have placed the object a little bit differently. When we do it together, we will make it a little bit more dynamic. The second one then is very creative. I put a lot of thought into that. Here we can already see that the studio setup looks a little bit more interesting with an object like this and the different shadows and such. The next one is this one. Feels a little bit underwhelming, but lots of potential in the techniques that we will learn for that one. And the last one is this one. The simplest technique, but it looks kind of cool with a different way of lighting it. Alrighty. As always, I will get started. I will talk a bunch of uninteresting things, and afterwards we will do it together. So initially, by the way, I wanted this to look kind of like a sponge. But then I was like, oh god, I had to put like too much geometry in it, and then the computer was getting really slow, so I was like, yeah, let's just go for some abstract coral thing. That's kind of like why it looks like this. If I would have done less, it could have been cheese. So I ended up with something in between that's neither. It's still a cool technique though. Anyways, so for the base of this, I need to create the basic structure of it. And I want it to kind of like grow out of the floor. Now, when I want to build something like this, I want to create the outline first, and then I can use the extrude. We've done this before. This time, however, I want to build it directly already on the floor. I don't want to have primitive shape, extruded, rotated around. I want to build it right where I want it. For that, I will use the so-called orthographic views. I think we have not really talked about them yet. We can find them by using this little button over here. When we click it, it switches to a 4-split view where we can see the top, the front, and the right of an element. If I create an element, like the figure here, it makes a little bit more sense. Our perspective view, the top view, the front view, and the right view. Kind of makes sense. These views are referred to as orthographic views or isometric views. You might have already heard the word isometric, right? When we model some, or we build some illustrations in Illustrator, for instance, that look like they're 3D, but they're not, because they don't have any perspective. So no matter how far away something is from one another, it will always have the same size. Here, for instance, if I duplicate this a couple of times backwards, and maybe I move each of them a little bit to the side, then I can see here, when I'm closer to one of them, that this one is a lot larger than the one in the back, even though they actually have the same size. So, because of perspective, things get smaller. In these views here, that doesn't happen. All the elements, even though they are further away from one another, in an orthographic view are always exactly the same size. Now, the main difference between isometric and orthographic is isometric means that we don't have a perspective, and orthographic means that it's isometric, but always coming from a flat side. So exactly the top, exactly the front, exactly the side, exactly the bottom. And an isometric view could also be angled a little bit. So sometimes I might refer to them as orthographic views, sometimes as isometric, whatever I feel like it. Both are correct in this case. So I want to start creating my shape here in the top view. By the way, in these views here, you cannot rotate around. Well, you can rotate around, but then things get kind of messy. So for instance, if I take, let's say, a platonic here, if I hold down 3 and I click and drag, I rotate around, and then it's like, just looks awful. So either you use the back button, not the back button, that doesn't make sense. The camera view and then frame default to go back. Or have I told you about the 2 different shortcuts for undoing? So exactly. Just to refresh, it also works in here. So I can either do something, for instance, I have this element and I move it 1, 2 times. If I hold Command Z, I let it go back. Command Y, I let it go forward. Or if I move around, especially if I rotate around, I can use Command Shift Z to undo these things, or Command Shift Y to redo these things. So if you ever hold down 3 accidentally in these views, either go to View and Frame Default, or you can just hold Command Shift Z to undo the camera move. Okay, so what I now want to do is I want to build this, let's call it a sponge shape. For that, I will use a custom shape built with a spline pen. In the spline pen, I have many different modes. So usually when we work in Photoshop or Illustrator, there's only one type of path that we can create. It's always a Bezier. You might have never questioned that until you work with After Effects. Have you ever used in After Effects the, how's it called? The Roto Bezier option? No? Then you will probably get to it at some point. The Roto Bezier essentially is just a different way of creating a path, or how a path's curvature is created based on the intensity of a point, rather than having tangents. So you will get there. In a 3D application, we usually have even more different types of paths. First, we have the regular Bezier. However, I really don't recommend using that in a 3D application. So we can see here, I can create a path, do whatever I want. This feels pretty much, well, like it usually works. But if I then go in here and I move a point around, I very quickly realize, okay, so now I have some very complex things that I need to take care of. So if I want my curvature to be different, I needed to rotate around in 3D space. And if I then want to change the tangent, I kind of have to do it in 3D space and always look at it from different angles in order to make this kind of like hopefully the shape that I want to. Working with these tangents in 3D space is really hard. I never learned it. Well, I learned it, but I never use it because it's just too much work. So usually Bezier only exists so that we could, for instance, build something in Illustrator and put it into Cinema 4D and continue working there. We'll also talk about that connection at some point in the future, just not today. For every other scenario, you want to use one of the other types. So let me see what they look like. Starting with the most basic one, linear. Linear simply creates points, and these points cannot have tangents or whatever. They will always be sharp edges. Boring, but, well, sometimes it is interesting to have that. Next, we have cubic. Cubic tries to, oops, I should have just, by the way, on a spline, you can always select it and just change the type here afterwards as well. So when I choose cubic, I can see how it creates this curvature automatically. This might feel a little bit similar to the newer versions of Illustrator, where you can just like create points and automatically creates a curvature, but in the end, it just creates a Bezier. This here never creates a Bezier, no tangents. We only have points that we move around, and we can see as I move around one of the points, all the other curves are adjusting automatically in order to create the smoothest shape possible. Now, there is, however, a little bit of a disadvantage because it always tries to be very smooth, but sometimes it does weird things. If points get too close to one another, we start to get this kind of like a loop here. So I could never have really a sharp corner somewhere. I will always have weird things. So if you need something that is always super smooth, this one is definitely a good solution. But if we want a combination of short or sharp corners and smooth endings, that's not it. The other option is Akami. It is very similar to cubic, just calculates the curvature a little bit differently, as we can see here. So cubic and Akami. Akami is usually a little bit sharper, less loops, but we can still have issues where it just overlaps in a really weird way. So also, actually, I've never used Akami in my life. Like, I don't really know why it's there. Oh, it's not even Akami. I didn't even pronounce it correctly. Akima. Oh my god, I've been mispronouncing it my entire life. Holy crap. Wow, that's embarrassing. Yeah, I never use it, so that's probably the issue there. So, Akima. Akaima. I don't know. The one that I use pretty much all of the time is the B-spline. A B-spline is completely different than the other ones because the path does not go through a point. It is kind of like just magnetically attached to it, a little bit like our follow position, just not dynamic. Here we can see if I move a point around, it always just like follows along with it, but the more I drag it away, the more it's like, gets further away from the point. This way we can create super, super smooth shapes, and if we move points close enough together, we can also create a sharp corner. So by just adding more points in a corner, we add a sharp corner. With Akima and cubic, we couldn't do that. If we just had more points in a corner, they just start doing weird, funky stuff. So B-spline is the most versatile option, and it was specifically designed for 3D applications because the math behind this curvature is also used in other parts of 3D. So you will most likely not see this behavior in other applications unless you work with Mocha. Have you ever heard of Mocha? Yeah. Maybe. Of you, of course. It is a really nice application. I think originally it was built from Imagineer Systems. Now it was bought by Boris FX. And they always had a free version of their program inside of After Effects. And it's used for rotoscoping and planar tracking. So these are more like advanced techniques that you usually don't talk about that much in the After Effects course that you might have. But it's still worth checking out. So if you just Google like After Effects and Mocha tutorial, some cool things that you can do with it. When it comes to rotoscoping and planar tracking, it's also the leading application in the business. So it's pretty awesome that they have like a light version of the tool inside of After Effects for free. And they use something similar like the B-spline. They, however, call it an X-spline that also has additional options for it. Anyways, you don't care. So most of the time, I will use the B-spline. Yes, sometimes I just ramble. So most of the time, I will use the B-spline. I will use it in this case as well. So I choose my spline, pen, and I choose my B-spline mode, and I just create a couple of points. No clicking and dragging, just click, and then click to create additional points. So I would just really roughly try to create this shape again. Since I don't even know what it is, I don't bother too much. When you're finished, you just click on the first dot again. If you realize, oh god, I'm building another spline, just hit undo until you're back to just your single spline here. When I now go back to my perspective view, I can see I have my shape here in 3D, all nice, and I want to extrude it out. So I go to my tools here, and I want to use the extrude. Then I drop the spline in the extrude, and I realize that this looks kind of flat. Doesn't really look extruded. So what do I have to change? The what? I think I liked his answer better. So right now, when we look at it, I explained it very briefly when we used it. It extrudes in a specific direction. So just because it gets an object, it doesn't automatically know which direction it should extrude into. So the default is the movement x, y, z, so along the z-axis. If I disable and enable the extrude, we can see, so it does create like our cap, and then it just slides it to the side. You get it? Perfect. I could then just say that it should also have some movement along the y-axis. So it by default just did this, but it didn't push it upwards. So that's what we need to do here. No movement along the z-axis and just a little bit along the y-axis. So far, so good. Now I have my basic shape here. It's too simple to do this together already. I will talk a little bit more. The next tool that we will use in order to create this kind of broken up shape is something that is called a volume builder. It was introduced in the last version of Cinema 4D, so R20, and it's pretty freaking cool. We already know that we have something like the bool, right? Where we have like object A and object B, and then we subtract them, and then we have a new thing. But the issue is that we always have very hard edges and not really a clean geometry to work with. And finally, after years, Cinema decided to help the people out, and they created this thing here, the volume builder. What this one does in short, if I have a volume, or an object like this sphere, I can simply drop it into the volume builder, and it creates this. There, it essentially creates so-called voxels. A voxel has a specific size. So you can see my voxel size is 10 centimeters. And then I will align these voxels next to one another into the geometry that we have, which means the smaller the voxels are, the more voxels can fit into our object. So far, so good. The more voxels we have also means the higher the resolution of the end result. So we can think of this kind of like a fog. And the smaller the voxels, the more denser the fog is and the more details we can have, the clearer the end result is. I can also add multiple objects in there. Let's maybe add a second sphere. Let's make it a little bit smaller and move it to the side, something like this, and drop it into the volume builder as well. Now I can see we have these two things kind of like together. Doesn't look too fancy right now. What we want always in the end is to convert this fog, this volume, into geometry, and we do that with the volume mesher. So we always have a volume builder, we put stuff inside it, and then we put everything into the volume mesher, and it creates geometry out of that. And we can see how it creates kind of like this merged thing. If I then take my sphere here, I can see it's kind of like, so it's kind of like a fluid of some sorts. We can then also add other things on it. So for instance, usually then we just increase the segments here so it looks a little bit nicer, and that is the opposite of increasing. Oh, I have my shift key. So a little bit smoother. Then we can also add things on top. For instance, a smooth layer. And here we can now see how I can move this around, and they're like water droplets doing stuff. We can also do other things with it. So by default, things are added on top of each other. But this list here is read from bottom to top. We can also have this layer subtracted. So it first has the first sphere, then the second sphere, which then subtracts from the previous one. So it does this. So I can cut things out of here. And if I then apply my smooth layer again, this is a little bit intense. Let's just make the voxels a little bit less. Then we can create really organic and smooth structures that we could never do with the bool. The bool always says like, this is our final thing and another final thing, and then we have very, very sharp edges when they subtract from one another. And here we can blur stuff out of it. We can create really smooth surfaces. So at this point, you could be like, okay, so I exactly know how you build this. So how did I build this? So apparently we already know we have the basic shape. So far, so good. Now I need something, apparently, that I put together with the basic shape into the volume builder and subtract it from it.
I'm sure you use some cloners.
Ooh, very good. So let's do that. So obviously I will use a cloner because we can see many things. So we see many things. The first thing we think of is cloner. So I will use a cloner. What kind of object could I use in here? Which of the primitives feels like it could be the most fitting to create holes? We remember that I said that if I used less, it would have looked like cheese. The sphere, exactly. So I take the sphere, I drop it into the cloner. Now, how can I place the sphere all up inside of the business of the extrude? Exactly. In the cloner, we change the mode from linear to object. And we then choose our extrude as that object. Now, by default, we should not forget it. It is only applied to the surface of it. So let me just make the sphere a little bit smaller. Zip. And if I create a couple of them now, just increase it like there's no tomorrow, we can see how we have these bubbles, but they are always on the surface, exactly. Which means if I subtract it, I just get these dents on the outside. Can also look nice and interesting, but I want it to be filling up the inside, so I have holes all over and this kind of cagey, corelli sponge feeling. So in the cloner, I change my mode from surface to volume, and I can already see, oh, all right, so some are more inside, some are on the outside. And I think I'll just pump this up like crazy to like 2,000 clones or so. Don't go really crazy. Like if you type in 2 million, your computer might die, so don't overdo it. Let's keep it in the hundreds to a few thousands. Okay, so far so good. So what do you think needs to happen next if I now want the cloner to be subtracted from the extrude? This volume thing, exactly. Do I put both of them inside the volume builder? Yes, exactly. So here we also realize, even though these are both usually containers where we just give an input and then it does something, these containers can also be put into other containers to create something new. So it doesn't have to be just this one level of child and parent. We can also have grandparents and great-grandparents. So the volume builder then merges these things together. But then I realize I don't really see that much detail, so I want some more details. What do I change to get more details? The voxel size, exactly. So when we have large voxels, it's kind of like using a very big brush on a very small piece of paper, so we can't really paint details. But when we use a smaller brush on the same paper, then we can add way more details. We want to be very careful though, because if I set this, for instance, to a value of 1, there are already a whole bunch more things there. So we can see we have a much, much higher resolution. From afar, it already looks like it's geometry, even though it's not. So when I look at it from very close, I can still see I still have my voxels. It's just a lot of them, so from afar they don't look like that much. They don't look like they are so dense. Now these ones here, I want to subtract. What was the option that I changed earlier? The mode, exactly. From union to subtract. By the way, the volume builder is a huge exception, as in it does not care in which order we place something in. So usually we only have things that accept only one input, or with the next tools that we learn, they have a very specific order in which elements need to be input. This one here doesn't care at all, because down here I can always change the order however I want to. So it doesn't matter what order is used up here, I can just use a different order there. Every time I change something, it needs to rethink and recalculate what it's supposed to do. Sometimes, depending on how large your object is, how many voxels you have inside, it might take a little bit longer. It is sometimes a little bit buggy where you're not sure if it's doing something or not. Usually in the bottom left corner, we can then see a progress bar of how much is done, but it doesn't really show progress. It just says, I'm doing something and I'm stuck, but now I'm done. So it usually works kind of like that. So now I can see basic shape is kind of here, but I feel like these dots here are too regular and still kind of like very sharp edges here. And when I look at this one, it looks a whole lot more blurry almost. So what do we do to give it that smoother look? Like really, I said smoother look, and there's only one thing. Let's use the SDF smooth thing. Let's try it out and see what happens. So apply the smooth thing, and this is kind of like an adjustment layer. So it first starts from the bottom, we have the extrude, then the cloner gets subtracted, and then a smooth is applied over everything, and then we have this result here. Now I can always adjust this and fine-tune it. I can go, for instance, into my cloner and increase the size of my sphere. However, when I do that, Cinema's like, no, wait. Now I have to do things. Now I have to think. And sometimes it doesn't really want to think. What I usually do is, because the volume builder takes so much power and time, I usually turn it off. Then I go to my sphere. I adjust the size until I feel like, yeah, this might work. And then I enable the volume builder again. Down here we can see it's doing something. Oh, I actually get it almost decent progress. And now I can see how everything looks more broken up. So here it's always kind of like, for this abstract thing, just kind of like a balancing act of the size and the amount of the spheres that we have. All right. So this might not be like a very useful specific example, but we now learned a little bit more about how we can use the extrude and what kind of possibilities we have with the volume builder. And I use the volume builder all the time. Like sometimes it is a little bit slow, but the possibilities are like endless of what you can do with it. So let's get to this point here together. Alrighty, so we start by going to our orthographic overviews. To do that, we will click on this icon over here. Then we want to switch to the top view, which is the top right one. In here, we want to create our own path. Just to already get used to how we will create paths in the future, we choose the pen tool, and we will change our type from Bezier to B-spline. Just click on the same icon again that you clicked on previously off that panel. Then we use the pen tool and we change the type to B-spline. And we just create some shape. You can also feel free to create another shape. Clicking on the first point closes the path. Now that we have our shape here lying on the floor, we want it to be extruded upwards. And extrude is already the word. We will go to our extrude container over there. It's a green one, so we put something inside of it. And we realize it's kind of like pushed to the side, not really what we want to. So we take a look at the settings of the extrude. So select the extrude, go to the attributes panel, and we want to change the movement along the y-axis. So just move it up a little bit and change the movement along the z-axis to 0, like this. 0, something, 0.
Sorry, when I try to switch between the screens, my shape is not in the difference in the other screens.
Let me check. Alrighty. Depending on how much you zoomed in or zoomed out of your top view, your object might have a different size. So all the values that we use today for this scenario here are kind of like a little bit made up and just roughly something. So I moved mine up by 60 centimeters. Yours might just be 6 or 600. It's fine for today. Next, we want to fill this object with spheres. Maybe 6 is a little bit too much, let's do less. First, we start to create a cloner. Then we need something to fill the cloner, so we'll use a sphere. So far, so good? Maybe a little tip, in the future it might be a little bit easier if our object, the extrude, is not too large. So if your relationship between the extrude and the sphere is roughly this, then you're fine. If your sphere looks a lot larger or a lot smaller, I recommend selecting the extrude, going to the model mode, and scale it down or up until it's kind of like this. It feels like it's in the same size of the world. So I don't know. So Cinema usually expects elements that it has to have roughly the size of a sphere or a cube. So, by the way, a sphere is 2 meters high, so it's already quite large. But this is kind of like the world that it lives in. And most of the elements that we create are built for this size. So if we create something that is a lot larger, then suddenly everything else that we create in Cinema looks really tiny, and also vice versa. So scale the extrude until we have roughly this relationship between a sphere and our extrude. Next, we want to scale down the sphere now, because it's way too large, and we drop the sphere into the cloner. In the cloner, we change the mode from linear to object. And as the object down here, we will choose our extrude. By default, it uses the surface, so we change it to volume. And then we just increase the count a lot. So, object, as the object we choose the extrude, the distribution should be volume, and we increase the count. So now it should look something like this.
It's so gross. It looks like small mouse. It was like a phobia thing, like you're scared of textures.
Yeah, we are scared of holes or... Sorry.
You're scared of holes?
No, I'll show you.
Yeah, but there are some really weird plants and such that just look really weird. Alrighty. Now that we have this, we want to now use the volume builder. It should then look already a little bit less scary when it's pixelated. So, volume builder, and we drop our cube, the cloner, and the extrude into the volume builder, like this. It might take a second, and then we should see something pixelated like that. So volume builder, this one here, and then drop our 2 other elements inside. I also closed the cloner and the extrude, just so it looks a little bit cleaner. Good. Then we realize that maybe this looks a little bit too pixelated, which means we want to decrease the size of the voxels, so we have more voxels to see more details. So we choose the volume builder, go to the voxel size, and usually I start to go in tenth, and then I go in smaller increments. So right now I will change my voxel size from 10 to 1, because I have now way more voxels. It takes a lot longer to calculate this, but I feel like this looks like a good resolution to start with. So far, so good? Good. Speaking of golf balls, we could build a golf ball with this exact technique. Right? Maybe I'll just show it really quickly after this. Just to get your mind in the right mindset. So I think a voxel size of 1 centimeter for my example here works fine. You might want to go to maybe 0.5 or 2, depending on how large the scene is. But if you adjusted your object to the size of a sphere, you should be able to use the same values that I have. Next, we want the cloner to subtract from the extrude. So we go to union and switch it to subtract. And we should now have something that looks a little bit cheesy. No. So far, so good? Now to make it less cheesy and a little bit more abstract, we want to smooth this out.
For me, you did the opposite. So instead of
All right. So now we click on the SDF smooth. I should really look into what SDF means. Like before it just meant smooth, and now it says SDF smooth. And I'm like, huh?
The sine distance field? What? The sine distance field? I don't know.
Where do you read that?
Yeah, it's in the volume type description. Up.
You hover over?
Volume type, sine distance field.
Sine distance field.
Ah. So what if I change this to vector or fog? Ah. Nice. Good. Alrighty. So let's use the signed distance field smooth on our signed distance field type of volume. I'm learning so much today. And we should end up with something like this. If you then feel like you have too many holes, then you can try to either scale down the sphere or change the amount of clones. When doing that, I generally recommend turning off the volume builder, because then it doesn't have to recalculate every single time. So maybe I go into the cloner, into the sphere, and just make my spheres overall a little bit smaller. Turn on the volume builder again, and then I should now have a pretty similar result to what I had in my original example. Yeah, looks about right. Maybe I can now use even more. Let's do 2,000. Next, we want to create actual geometry, because still, even though it looks like geometry, this is something where we could not apply a material to, because this is not a surface of some sorts. It's just this fog, although I should not call it fog because they have fog as a different type. So we just have this SDF, and an SDF is obviously not an actual geometry. So we want to convert this into a mesh by using the volume mesher. And we just drop, oh, I clicked on the volume builder again, volume mesher. And we just drop the volume builder into the volume mesher. It might need to think again for a moment, but after that we should get geometry that looks pretty similar to what the volume builder has shown us in the preview. So far, so good? All right. So now working with the volume builder is nice. We can create fancy geometry. However, this geometry makes our scene very heavy, because the volume builder constantly is like, oh my God, you've changed something. Let me start over completely and recreate this volume. And then the volume mesh is like, oh my God, I have a new volume, so let me create a new mesh. And then it just takes always some time, and the computer just freezes constantly, and you're like, holy crap, this is annoying. So what I usually do is I create a merged version of this. So take a look here. We do it not together first, just me. Afterwards, we repeat it together. So just to show you what the issue is, if I have my volume measure selected and I want to move it around, wow, did you see it? I dragged it a lot up, and then it was like, so this is how nice the performance is when you do something with a volume measure. It's not your computer that has too much to do, because I can still navigate around. So it's not my cinema, or it's not the viewport that is being stuck. It's just the volume measure that's like, oh my god, I'm moving, I have to recalculate everything. So that's kind of annoying. To not have this issue, to be able to work with this like a normal person, we want to merge this down. And we already know that we can merge stuff down by using the shortcut C to convert a primitive to polygons, or we can use the button here that says make editable. Don't do that now. If we do that, however, I lose everything. So when I hit C, it for some reason has to recalculate everything instead of taking what it has. Now I have just this object, which is kind of like what I want. I want this because now I can just move it around like normal, because this is now done and ready and easy to use. But I cannot change stuff anymore. I've kind of like lost my history. So that's not good. Let me undo. What I want to use instead is a functionality that is called current state to object. So I right click on this, and then I choose current state to object. This does exactly the same thing, but on a duplicate of it. So it duplicates this, and then it makes it editable. Choop. It needs to think again for a little while. And then I have my volume measure here, but I still have my original. Now, of course, I don't need this one here anymore, and I could just hide it like this, so I don't see it anymore. But we know this just hides it. It doesn't disable it, so it might still constantly want to recalculate shit, which I don't want. So to save me time and power for my computer, I just make sure that all of the children are open, and additionally to making it invisible, I also tell Cinema to not calculate anything there. So no spline is created, no extrude, no sphere, no cloners, nothing. So essentially, this is just a placeholder, but it doesn't take up any power. So we have this as a backup, and we have our volume measure that we can then work with in an easy way. Next, I want to create a scene for this.
Why is my volume measure black?
So, let's now take a look at, I rotated something. Oh yeah, I rotated the object. Let me show you how we can build a studio setup. So usually when we have a real studio, we have kind of like this backdrop thing, this L shape. Do you have an idea of how this could be built? We have 2.5 ways of doing that, and you already know them. 2.5. We will use the simplest one, but we'll still show you the other ones just because they're cool. So I want just this L-shaped backdrop kind of thing. Exactly. So what is the object that I bend?
A cylinder or
A cylinder? So, wait. Just imagine like you in reality, you would have a piece of paper that you then bend upwards. So, what looks like a piece of paper? Thank you. So, I have this plane. Now, do you remember kind of like the rule for perspective and direction that I told you in the first session? when I want to bend something, I define pretty much where the back of my scene is. So on which side should it be? Should it be this side, or should I bend this side up, or this side up, or that side up? What is the side that should be moved upwards? I don't really expect you to answer it correctly or at all. Oh my God. Exactly. So we learned the camera always looks in the z direction, so objects facing us should face away from the z-axis. So the back of our backdrop should be where the z-axis points to. So this is the side that should move upwards. In the end, not that important, but cinema, when we build things, just expects stuff to be this way. So it just makes our life a lot easier if we conform to that rule. So I will create this bend. A bend is a deformer, so I drop it into the plane. Quick question. If I now increase the bend, will this work? Exactly. Right now the bend is looking upwards, and it expects something at the top to bend around. But I don't have anything in the top. So if I now use the bend, it just kind of like rotates the entire thing around. So it grabs it and then just moves it around. Not really what I'm looking for. So I need to rotate it around, and want to rotate it so that the top, so the one with the dot here, points into the z direction, so I can then take the z direction and move it upwards. Make sense? Perfect. So I hit R for the rotation. I can kind of like still see the z here on the floor. And I hover over the red axis, click and drag, hold down Shift, and I go to -90 degrees. Now I bend it again, and I realize I'm close. At least now it's bending, just not in the direction that I want. I now have the option to either rotate the bend around or just change the angle of the bend to whatever angle I want. So in this case, apparently -90. So my strength will be 90, and the 90, not 0. And then I have my backdrop here. Now, since this backdrop looks kind of like a little bit angled, what is usually the issue? When something looks edgy, segments. Exactly. I'm missing segments. So I go to my plane, and I see I have my width segments. I increase the value, and I realize nothing is happening. So apparently it's not the width. So I go to the height segments, and I increase those, and I'm like, So don't overdo it. Always remember, change these values up to the point where it looks fine. So a value of 50 is apparently fine. There's one small thing that I want to change as well. If I go to display and go rotating lines, I can see how this is not really regular. I can see how it stretches it a bit. We used it also with the, I think, with the umbrella. So in the bend, we can say keep y-axis length, and then it's just a way more regular grid. I can then just scale up my bend deformer to define how smooth I want the surrounding to be. Then I can take the plane overall, move it backwards, maybe make it a little bit larger, maybe make the bend a little bit smaller again. So I have this kind of like presentation table here. So this was option number 1, and the option that we will go for. Let me, however, show you with what we've learned today and in our first session to create something that is a little bit, I wouldn't say smarter, but just a different setup. So I could just say, well, I can go to my orthographic views, right? And then I can say, I just look at it from the side, and I just create the outline of what I'm looking for. So I go to my right view, then I use the pen in B-spline, and I just create a couple of points here. Chip, chip, chip. So already I'm creating a shape that is a lot more natural, whereas the bend has like super straight here, super straight there, and then a perfectly round corner. And here I'm creating something that is a little bit more natural, where I can also move these points around a bit and change how this curve looks like. Then I will put it into an extrude. The extrude goes not the way that I wanted to, so I changed the z to 0, and it should go into the x-axis. like that. But now I only have half of it. So if I want the other half, what do? Thinking back to our first session, fit. What would we do? Huh? Not cloner? Symmetry, exactly. So I just use not in here. The symmetry, and I drop the extrude inside of it. So now, well, I could make it longer, but it's not centered. So every time I now make it longer, I would then have to readjust the position so that it's nice and centered. But if I work with the symmetry, I don't need that anymore. I just make it longer and it will always stay nicely centered. And I can always go to my spline points and just adjust this however I want that, or change the curvature like this. So I'm a lot more flexible and I create something that looks a little bit more natural. But overall, it's kind of like the more complex thing to think of. Usually working with a bend is something that's a little bit more straightforward, and it is what we will go for today. I just wanted to show you how we can also use techniques that we just learned earlier.
Well, then often probably instead of using a pen, it is a little more natural if you go for the pen tool and then extrude the object.
No. Because here I just have a flat surface, but what if you have, like you said, a tube, and I want to bend this? How would I ever do that with, you know? So the bend in this scenario could be replaced with that other technique, but I couldn't use the symmetry and the extrude and the spline in order to create this. Doesn't work. However, if I build this, I can also build it in a completely different way with more control than that one. But we'll talk about it at the end of the session when we have our fourth and last example, if I remember. I forget things very quickly. Alrighty, so this is just the basic floor, which I will keep the way that it is. And let me go back to the rotating here. And now I want to create some lights. We used in the past just these infinite lights to keep things simple, but an infinite light is like a sunlight. However, in a studio, we usually don't have a sun in there at our convenience. So what type of lights do we usually use?
Infinite light.
That's the one that we don't have.
But usually we use that.
No, in the reality. In the reality, if we are in a studio, what are the kind of lights that we use? Spotlight. What usually looks a little bit better than a spotlight, because a spotlight is like this small light, we get really hard shadows, so we use a softbox. And an area light pretty much represents a softbox. Now this area light has a specific size. Let me just move it back a little bit and move it up. So we can see how the area light has a specific size, and by default it lights into the Z direction. It also lights in the other direction, which is a little bit unrealistic. I will talk about that in a moment. But for now we just think it lights up in the Z direction. For all the lights that we have, we obviously need to create shadows. So I enable the shadows here. If I want to see a preview of it, I go to Options and enable the shadow here. So now I can move this around, and I can see how as I move my light, the shadow moves around and behaves differently. Just me doing. When I have the light and I make it a little bit smaller, or larger, I can see the shadow in the preview doesn't make a difference. However, if I now render this, I can see that my shadow is pretty sharp because it is a pretty small light. If I, however, zoom out and I make the light a whole lot larger like this, and I render it again, now my shadow is a whole lot softer. So an area light creates a shadow based on its size, which also means if the light is closer and quite large, then the shadow will be softer, and when the light keeps the same size but goes further away, the shadow will become sharper again, just like a real softbox in reality does. So far, so good. already we can see how this is a pretty nifty setup. We don't have to have like this weird infinite floor thing. We have light that is being caught on our backdrop, and it just looks a little bit more natural than the generic 3D renderings that we've done in the past. Now there are a couple of more things that we want to change with the light. First up, I think it's kind of annoying to have to like move the light around and always have to tell it to kind of like point at the object, otherwise weird things will happen. So with the lights, we usually target them. To target a light, you right-click on it, you then go to animation tags for whatever reason, and you find the target tag. In there, you will then choose what the target is, and as the target object, I will choose my volume measure. Which now means if I take my volume measure, for instance, and I move it around, the light will always look at it. And it will also make it a lot easier for me to move the light around, because now, take a look here. It takes some getting used to, but from now on, we don't move it on an axis anymore. We don't even touch the light at all. We just click in an empty area and click and drag the light to the side, and we can see how we move it like this. So when we want to get the light to a specific position, we move it roughly where it's supposed to be, and we see how it always moves based on my view. So I look at it from this angle, and it moves based on that view sideways. If I rotate my camera around, it will now move along this axis. So it always moves along the axis that is perpendicular to the camera view. So you always place a light and you rotate around. If I now want to move it more up, I get my camera into position and then I move it more up. I also rotate it around the z-axis, so it looks a little bit weird right now. Much better. So you always move around with the camera, look at your scene, look at the shadows, and adjust the position of the light. Like this. Okay, so usually, however, having just one light doesn't cut it. Most of the time we want multiple lights in our scene, right? So I just want a second light as well. I hold down the control key, I click anywhere, and just create a second light here. Usually when I have a second light, I make it a little bit larger and I place it a little bit more to the side and lower, just to have a different angle, a different type of shadow that I get. Now this, however, doesn't look too realistic. Now when I imagine having a photo shooting and having these lights there, the reality would not look like this. What I mean is this thing here. I will take the microphone off, maybe we can still hear me. And right now I have my flashlight. Oh my god, I just looked into it. Off my phone. If I have a light here on the wall, we can see how we get this fall off. We can see where the light is. It's super intense. The further away we are, the, well, less intense it is. So also when I move it away, it has a completely different behavior on our surrounding. And this is called a fall off, or how it fall offs, is that a word? It's called the decay. And we want to add that to our lights as well, if we want lights that behave more realistically. So I select my two lights. I can do it very easily by simply selecting them with the Command key or the Shift key. And when I have two objects selected that have the same properties, I can see them down here. Light object, two elements, and then they're listed here. And now all the things I change for both lights at the same time. I will go to the details, scroll down, and here I can find the fall off. And there I choose inverse square physically accurate. And now I can see, So I have my one light over here, for instance, and when I move it closer, we can see how it really explodes, like a regular light bulb does when it's close to an object. Usually, we want this fall off to be as large as our light is. So we drag this down to the size of the light source. I will do it here as well. And then we just make our lights brighter until they look proper. So I choose my one light here. It's a little bit smaller, so it needs to be a little bit brighter to compensate. Like this. We always want to drag it high enough so our object in the center gets enough light. We, however, don't want things to completely overexpose and explode. So something like this. I also keep in mind it can explode here a little bit because my camera is not here. I will not see this part. When I zoom in, this is what I see. So if it explodes a little bit on the sides, I don't care. Then I have my other light, and I do the same thing. Just increase it a little bit until I feel like I have a decently lit scene. Already we can see this looks a lot more interesting just by changing this fall off on the lights. Now I can take a look at my object, and maybe just to make it look a little bit cooler, I will just like rotate it around and put it on the floor so it casts like crazy ass shadows. Bam! Render. There we go. This looks a lot more interesting than the render that I did earlier. So here you can see maybe I've overdone it with the lights a little bit. Although on my screen it looks fine. I think it's just the TV that makes it look a little bit brighter than it's supposed to be. But I think I can go one step further. So in 3D, also there it looks a little bit weird because it's yellowish. But when you render it, you will see it looks just gray and gray. But usually lights have a little bit of a tint to them. And that's kind of like what we want to play with. For this example here first, I will do it way too extreme, and then we tone it down to something more realistic. Have you ever heard of orange and teal? So it's kind of like this concept that many posters and whatever have, where they have like an orange color and then an opposing complementary color, which is teal or kind of like a cyanish light blue. So this is a color combination that always looks cool, and because I'm not a graphic designer or whatever, I'll just use that one. One of my lights, the main light, I will give this orangey color, and I increase the saturation here. And then I can see how this one lights up my scene in orange. Then I can select the other light, and there I will also saturate it quite a lot, and there I go into the blue light. So here we can now see, it starts to look interesting. I then hit render, and I can see how everything gets calculated together, and I have a super cool dynamic light setup here. Lastly, I'm just missing a couple of textures. So usually then later on I reduce it by a lot. So I usually work with 5 to 10% saturation, just to give like the feeling of having different light sources. I don't want it to be that much unless I want to create something that's super abstract. So for this example, I would just go for 10% just to have a little bit of a difference. So when we now render, I'm not sure if we can see it, well, we can still feel it a little bit there. We can see how it is warmer on the left, colder on the right. We have a little bit of contrast. It doesn't look as boring as the original one.
Actually, I think it's kind of cool when you have this border about it.
Which one?
Before you render, you know, the floor, because it looks like in the kitchen when you clean.
The tiles.
Kind of cool tiles.
Yeah. We can, of course, also add these tiles, just to show you real quickly. In Cinema 4D, we do have a couple of things. Most of them are kind of cheapish. We can add it anywhere by going to the texture and not adding a texture with a ... by clicking on this arrow. And there we can see we not only have color or Fresnel, what we've used so far, we also have something that is called effects or surfaces. And on surfaces, we have really weird things, but all of them look really like 90s. So for instance, if I go to like something like Venus, you're like, oh my God, this sounds so fancy. And then you just get It could be something. Or what else do we have that is kind of, if I have like planet, I just get different stripes and colors, like whoosh. We also have water is also awful. We have one, although the water is, actually the water is not awful, the water is really cool, but it looks kind of awful. So here it's just this. It can be cool when, I'll talk about it later, not today when we work with transparent textures, but that's a more advanced thing.
Does it reflect?
Nope. But we will use it in combination with reflection, and then it's awesome. So this water right now doesn't look good. We also have something like a checkerboard. So that could be something that we have kind of like the kitchen floor. Or we also have The one that is called T. Where's T? Not effects. Surface. T for tiles. Because we have different types of tiles. Where we can also say that it should be bricks or... Yeah, so I said 90s, right? I mean, that one can be kind of cool. But not necessarily. So here could work with, for instance, what was kind of like the most basic one? No, what am I looking for? This one. There I could say that I use red should be white, and gray should be white as well, and this one is black, and then I have kind of like these lines, and I can apply this then to my plane, and when I render, I then have these lines on there. And then of course I can change the size of them, so global scale maybe just 20. Oh my god, that looks awful. Yeah, then we just need to play around with the bevel sizes. Probably the opposite. Just like 1. Still awful. That's the one that needs to change. Yeah, something like that. And there I can see when I have a white background, apparently my lights are a little bit too bright and overexpose everything. Anyways, just to have shown something in between. Not what I'm looking for in this example. Where was I? After the colors. Now I'm just missing the colors of my object.
Can we maybe follow and then proceed?
Almost there. Almost there. So for this example, we will again turn off the reflectance. I will use maybe a bluish color for the floor. I don't make it too bright or too saturated, something like this. So it should work quite nicely together with my lights. And the object itself, I will give a spongy orange color. Oops, I should be able to drag. There we go. And then I render, and then I can see how the colors of my lights are not that visible anymore, but we can still feel it. We can still feel how our blue background is not just a single color anymore. It is kind of like a little bit of a color shift there, not so visible on that screen though. And we can see also a slight bit of a color change on our object. One more thing that I often like to do is adding a sky on top, just to make sure that our shadows are super soft and that we don't have that many dark areas here, to make sure that from every side at least there's a little bit of light. So for that, I create another sky. We've also done this in the past. Turn off color and reflectance, only turn on the luminance, set it to 50, and I apply it to the sky. Since I now don't see the sky anyways because I have my backdrop, I don't need to hide it or whatever. I just hit render, and it just makes everything a little bit brighter, a little bit smoother and softer. And on the screen it just looks super so overexposed, but here it's nice. I mean, I could say anything. I could be like here, this is like, that looks complete shit, but like on my screen it's like awesome. But it really does look much better. Okay, so let's do this together. So I've cleaned up my scene, so we should be back to this stage here, where we have our volume measure that we want to make editable and easier to work with. So for that, we right-click on the volume measure, then we go to current state to object. It might take a second, and after a few seconds, we should have a polygon version of the volume measure. So now we want to make sure that our volume measure doesn't calculate stuff anymore. Just hiding it is not good enough. We also need to disable the checkboxes so that Cinema doesn't calculate stuff anymore. Now, for the most part, it would be enough to just turn off the volume builder, because that is the one that takes up power. But the cloner also takes up power. It still creates these clones. They're still there in the background. In the end, it will not make the render time longer or whatever, but it can slow down our scene in some cases. So just to not have to think about what makes sense to turn off, I just turn off everything that I can. It's simpler and most efficient. No. If I have it like this, for instance, then these things are still getting generated, especially the volume builder. It's just the volume mesher that doesn't have an effect on it anymore. No. No. So these things are only for that element. The checkbox is only for that element if it is activated or not. It does not get inherited to the children. So all of them should be turned off. It just makes our life a whole lot easier. Goody. Now we should be able to select the volume mesher and be able to kind of like move it around and do whatever stuff we want with it. Choo. If you ever move something around and you feel like, oh, I wanted to get back to where it came from, you can use this button here, which is called Reset PSR for position, scale, and rotation. And just hit the button, and then it goes back to the center where we created it. So right now, we don't move it around. We will do that later. For now, we want to build our backdrop. For that, we create a plane, and we make it a little bit larger. The exact size doesn't matter. We can always change it later on. Then we create a bend deformer. Then we figure out where the Z direction is. So with Move tool, we can see it the best. So the Z direction, in my case, now goes to the top right corner. So that is where I want my bend deformer to be rotated to. So with the bend deformer selected, we hit R for the rotation, hover over the red axis, click and drag, hold down Shift, go to negative 90 degrees, release the Shift, release the mouse, and then the Shift key. When we now take the bend and we drop it into the plane and we increase the strength, we should see how it bends left and right. So far, so good? Lastly, for the bend, we just change the strength to 90 and the angle to negative 90. And then we should have something that looks like this. Alrighty. Next, we want to increase the segments so that this looks less awful. Right now, the edge and the back is just not good. So we select the plane, and we already know that it's the height segments that we want to change. So they would just click and drag on the arrows and increase it until it looks decent, and it is somewhere around 50 segments. That it should look good. Yeah. Then we also know that our geometry will look kind of weird. We want to keep it clean, so we usually always remember when using a bend, we want to enable the keep y-axis length. Now we can start scaling up the bend if we want to. So just go to the scale tool, make sure you're in the model mode and have the bend selected, and just click and drag anywhere to define what the angle or the radius of the bend is supposed to be. Then we can.
Keep y-axis length.
That is what we enabled, yes.
Okay, yeah, so enable this.
Enable this, and then you adjust the size of the bend until you have the size that you want to. And scale and move the plane until our object is nicely presented on there. We don't want to move our object to the front, because everything that we create with Cinema 4D will be placed in the center of the world initially. And if our bend and the curvature there is in the center of the world, then everything is always just kind of like messed up. So we want objects to be in the center of the world, and that is where the presentation area of our backdrop is. Yes?
And then if we move the plane further away from the center of the world, also the height of the wall lowers.
It doesn't, because what you are moving is the plane. Take a look here.
Okay.
You have just the bend selected, and if I move the bend, I'm bending a different part of this element. So make sure that you have the plane selected and move it together with the bend. Alrighty. Next, we want to create our lights. We click and drag onto the regular light, and we choose an area light. We know that an area light will be easier to handle when we target it. So after we created the area light, we right-click on it, go to Animation Tags, and choose the Target tag. Do we all have the Target tag on our light?
What does it mean? Like, what will be the result of it? Of the target?
It targets something. So if I have my bottle here, and I put a target tag on it, and I tell it to target my laptop, it does this. So I can move it around, and it will always automatically look at the laptop. Otherwise, if I move something around, it would just do like this, not target the laptop. So with the target tag selected, we will go down to the target object field, and we either drag in or use the button here to pick our volume measure. I would choose I was about to say pixelated version, the polygon version of the volume measure, because if we move it around, it would be nice if our light really follows it. Now the light by default kind of like sits very weird, so we just click and drag in an empty area while we are in the move tool, and just click and drag it away, and we realize how it moves away and always nicely focuses on our object. So this takes some getting used to. You can still also work with the axes, so move it on one axis and on another one, but I always feel like, especially with the target on it, it is a little bit weird to move it around. So I prefer just moving the camera, our view, around, and then just moving the light based on the view that we have. When it comes to distances and sizes, always try to stay kind of realistic, how you would also light up a scene in reality. So for instance, if I had a softbox and I want to light this up, I would not have a softbox that is this large, this close to my element. I mean, where would I put my camera? If I would have my camera here, then I would have half of the softbox in front of me. So always think about a realistic light setup, where your camera would be and where you realistically kind of would place the softbox in order to light up your scene. So I do want it to be a little bit larger and definitely a little bit further away. So something like this. So far, so good. Now, to judge a little bit better how our shadows are falling, we, most importantly, need to enable the shadows for our light source. So we select the light, we go to the type, and change it from, shadow from none to area. So we have a type of an area light and a shadow of area as well. In order to see the shadow in the editor as well, like I have it, you click on Options and you choose Shadows. Then we want a second light that is a little bit contrasting. So with our first light selected, you just hold down the Control key and click and drag anywhere to duplicate a second light over. That one I would just place a little bit more to the side, make it a little bit larger and a little bit further down. Hold down the Control key and drag it in the editor. Alrighty. Now we want to change the fall off of our lights. In order to change the fall off of the lights, we want to have both of them selected. To select both lights, you select one, hold down the Command or Control key, and select the other one. Now, whenever we change something in the Attributes panel, it will change for both lights at the same time. We go down to the Details, go down to the Area Shape. No, that's not right. There we go, fall off. That Details. We go to the fall off and we change it from none to inverse square physically accurate. And already we can see how our light setup looks a whole lot more interesting and dynamic. We did it for both. Some little thing in between. It might happen that this list here suddenly becomes empty. There is a shortcut that can do that. I, however, don't know what the shortcut is. There is kind of like the isolation mode in Illustrator, where you double-click something and you only focus on stuff that is inside, or like in After Effects, where you double-click on a composition, then you go inside of it and you don't see the rest that is outside. It's kind of like that. And it is under View and here, because I could say that I want to see only the insides of my plane. So I could select the plane, go to View, and then I can say Set as Root. And then everything is gone, and I only see the bend. So there's a shortcut that can do that. And simply to revert this, go to View and say, go to Main Level, and everything should be back. So just a little tip. I don't know, I've never had that in the past years, but since the last release already, students constantly had that issue where just suddenly they were inside of an object. And I don't know how that happens. There must be a shortcut or something.
They're in an object.
Yeah. They're trapped. All right. Now, the general rule of thumb is that the decay, so the fall off, should have the same size as the light source itself. So when we select our light, we can see how we have the size of the light, which is this rectangle, and then we have this larger sphere around it. As long as we are in the model mode, we can see these highlights, these hotspots. Just hover over one of them and click and drag to change the size of the fall off to have roughly the same size as the cube, or rather rectangle. And we do that for both lights. So select the light, find the hotspot for the decay, and drag it to an appropriate size based on the rest of the light.
Do you have to press something?
No. Now, as soon as we change the fall off, the light gets less intense. So we have to then compromise by making the light sources themselves lighter. Because each light source has a different size, it now has also a different intensity. So we want to select each light individually and increase the intensity here. And intensity can be dragged above 100% by just dragging the arrows larger. So here it can be that we go to values like 200, 500, maybe even 1,000, depending on the size of the light and how far away it is. just until it looks decent. We always need to adjust the intensity later on when we render. We can then put our object in a more dynamic pose, because it's kind of like flat on the floor, so it obviously looks a little bit lame. But when we hit R and rotate it around, and then maybe move it up a little bit, it can look a little bit more dynamic. By the way, to move something up that is rotated, remember, we can use this button here to use it based on the world axis. It just makes it a lot easier to keep it centered and only move it upwards. All right, almost done with this. The last few things are just adding some lights to the colors, adding colors to our objects, and adding a sky just to get a little bit more of a professional, softer look. The sky just really adds a tiny bit of a difference, but I feel like it makes it overall a little bit nicer. Maybe let's start with the sky, actually. For the sky, we click and drag on the floor, and we choose the sky object. Then, to be able to control the color a little bit better, we create a new material. Double-click in an empty area down here, and double-click on the material to open it up. A sky should only consist of luminance, so make sure that both the color and the reflectance are turned off. No checkboxes. Then we can click on the luminance channel here on the name to select it, enable it, and change the brightness to 50%. Then we apply this material to our sky. We do not need to hide the sky because we never see it anyways. When we now render, we should see how everything looks overall a little bit brighter and a little bit softer. It's not a big difference, but a small one. So far, so good? Next, we change the color of our lights. We select each light at a time. One light I will make a little bit orangey, and I would only go to 10% of the saturation. I don't want to overdo it. And the other one gets a bluish color, also 10%. When we then render, it should look like this. Now the last step is just creating two colors and turning off the reflectance for that. I use an orange, kind of, for my object. That is not an orange, doesn't matter. And a bluish color for the background. Alrighty. Yeah, that's green. Let me see if I can, in the break, optimize a bit. Yeah, just turn off reflectance. In our next session, we will talk about reflectance and other types of materials. For today, we keep it fairly simple and matte still. Alrighty. Are we good? Great. Then our first example is done. We will take a break of like 10, 15-ish minutes, so a little bit longer. The other breaks will then be a little bit shorter. Yeah, and when we continue, we will continue with the next one, which is, I already forgot. Oh yeah, the super creative bottle. Alrighty, now let's take a break and see you again in 10 to 15 minutes. Alrighty, now that we have our basic studio setup done and our first element in there, let's now see how we can build something else with a completely different technique. For that, I will use this beautiful bottle. Their branding, by the way, is that you're only allowed to put tap water in it. That's what they say. When you buy it, you are only allowed to put tap water in it. And I only do that, being environmentally friendly. Okay. Then, in order to build this, I want to use kind of like a reference. So I don't just have to draw it on my own. I show you how this works, and afterwards we will do it together. The light setup and then will be super simple. So the next few or the next three things that we will model will actually be much, much faster than the one that we built first. Okay, so let's take a quick look, and it's called Doppler. And we just look for images, and we just find look for an image, and we can see, oh, that is mine. Then I can just save this image on the desktop, for instance. I already did that yesterday, so I will go back to Cinema 4D, and I will start with a new project. Then I will go to my front view. In the front view, I will then go to the viewport settings. You can find them. I always forget where to find it. The shortcut is Shift-V, or you can go to Options, Configure. There we go. In here, we have different settings of how the viewport looks like, how things are shown. What I want, however, is the back of the viewport. There I can click on the dot, 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 and I can then choose an image. And then I now have in my viewport an image that I can then use kind of like to trace whatever I want to draw. I will change the transparency. I just crank it up a little bit so I can see my grid and my elements a little bit better. I then zoom in, and the lathe behaves kind of like, wait, what was it? Kind of like, do you know these wood turning things? Or Ghost?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can see it.
Exactly. So it works like this. Essentially, you can think of something is turning, and we define how it looks like on one side. And because it's turning, it will then look like that on all the sides. I've been teaching Cinema 4D since almost 10 years, and every single time I explain it, I want to be like a super geeky person and tell you how that is called, like the mathematical term. Like something can be symmetrical, but there's a special word for it if it's like symmetrical, kind of like all the way around. But I don't know the word, and I always forget it. No, that sounds too simple. It's probably some weird word. Isodemetric something.
Like a star, or
Yeah, also like a star, maybe something like, I don't know.
it is radial symmetry, but there's probably
Well, then from the future on, I will just say, so this is kind of like a radial symmetry. I mean, that describes it quite nicely. Even more I've learned today. Okay, so for that one, it means I only need to draw 1/2 of my element, and that's it. And the rest will then be revolved around. So Cinema 4D is the only application that calls this one a lathe. Everyone else calls it a revolve, which kind of makes a little bit more sense to normal people. So we start with the pen tool, and we will choose again the B-spline. Then in here, we start in the center, and we click. In the corner, we want it to be a little bit sharper, so we create multiple points. Usually, to define a corner, we use 3 points. One outside of the corner, one at the beginning, and one at the end of the rounding. So here the same, a little bit outside, and then the end of that. So here also 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And here I should not be irritated by the rounding of it, because like when I look at it from the top, it looks curved, but when I look at it from the side, I can see that it's actually a very straight thing. So perspective is going on here. In the picture, same issue. I don't want this to be round, it should be flat, so I just cut off a little bit here. When I now want to finish with this path without closing it, I simply hit escape. So now I have this. Next, I want to make sure that my top and my bottom are perfectly flat. So obviously this also goes a little bit down, but let's ignore that part for now. We could also always edit later. So the top I want straight and the bottom I want straight. How could I align these points? So right now, this point might be up here, this point might be a little bit lower here, and I want these 3 points that are on my top to be perfectly aligned to one another. Shift key doesn't really work. There are also no align options. So if I can't align it, what else could I do to have things that have a height of some sort to be squished down, to not have a height anymore?
Do you have guides?
Not for this. Well, I could always have something snap to a grid, but the grid might not be where I want my line to be. Let me give you a hint. If I have something like the landscape, for instance, let me just make it like this. If I don't want this to look like a landscape, but I want it to look like a flat surface, what do I do? It is a good point. What do I do to make it flat?
Reduce the elevation.
How do I compress it? How do I compress it? The Y with what? Aha. So I can take the scale tool and just and now I have hundreds of points perfectly aligned, almost perfectly. So by scaling this down, I made it flat. I can then do the same thing with a selection of points. So back in my scene here, I would make sure that I have the points selected that I want. I usually use this tool here, the live selection, so I can just click and drag over the points that I want to select. Then I can either hit T for the scale. However, the scale can also invert. So when I scale it down, it can then also go into the other direction. So that's usually not what I use. Instead, I will use the scale option down here, where I see it has a height of 10 centimeters, and I just tell it to have a height of 0 centimeters. Hitting enter, and now they're perfectly flat. I then do the same thing for the bottom as well. Selecting the 3 points, going to the Y size, nothing, enter, and now they're perfectly aligned. I could also do it with these elements here. If I knew that these are perfectly straight but upwards, then I can also do it here, and then I do it for the x-axis. And now they're perfectly aligned as well. Same goes for these ones here, x-axis, 0, perfectly aligned. So we don't have alignments per se, but we can just scale stuff down and thereby aligning them. I also want to make sure that these 2 dots here, so this one, let me just move them a little bit so we can see what will happen. So these 2 here need to be exactly in the center, otherwise we get weird overlaps or holes. So also there, x should be 0 in the size, and the x position should also be exactly 0. So they are now exactly on my y-axis in the center. I will then continue doing that by deselecting the spline to create a new one, and then I just click, 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 click. I will not align these things because I'm lazy. I deselect my spline to create a new one, and I'm just going to do it like really, really roughly, quickly. Now also here, there's some rounding, but I will cut off the bottom a little bit. The only ones that I really care about, I can select the two new splines at the same time, and I can select the points that are supposed to be in the center. Oh, it doesn't let me scale them on different objects. That's lame. So I have this one point should be 0, and this one point should be 0. There we go. When I go to my perspective view, I can now see how I have the separate objects like this, and already I can pretend to see that it's something, and then just create the lathe multiple times because I need multiple materials, and then I just drop every spline into its own lathe, and I'm done. Easy, isn't it? So when we have something that has a radial symmetry, we only draw one half of it. That half gets rotated around, and at the same time creating geometry. Simple as that. Okay, let's do this together. So easy. So we start by looking for an image of this bottle. I recommend using the same bottle. You can of course use another image, but I recommend using the same one here. So just look for Doppler, because I've seen people using other images and they are then for some reason WebP images, and Cinema doesn't read WebP. So rather stick to the regular one here because it's a JPEG and it's easy to import it into Cinema 4D then.
What is so special about these?
Huh?
What is so special about these fonts?
Nothing really. They have an interesting design. You can kind of like also take off this part here and use it as a cup. And otherwise they just have a really interesting design. And I like that they are metal, so in the winter they get really cold, but I love it. And it's such a nice, clear taste that you then get. I'm passionate about everything that I do.
They're really hyped in Amsterdam.
I know my parents were in Amsterdam and they saw them. That's how I know of them. My parents tried to do weed, so they bought some, and they bought like 2 cookies, but they only ate like half of a cookie, and they even split it among each other. and my mother told me she got like super paranoid. She's like, oh my God, am I feeling something already? Am I getting sick? And my father was like, I'm getting such a headache. And then they were like too chicken to try the rest. And then I think that the rest of the cookies they just threw away, and the how do you call it then? The thing, the weed, smoky pipe, joint. Yeah, the joint. They just like gave it to some people at a cafe, and they're like, here.
And went to bed.
And then they went to bed, pretty much. Which was very lucky because they almost forgot about them, and on the way back you get searched. And it's like really funny when you are at the border from Amsterdam to Germany, they then ask you, okay, so you're not allowed to take anything from here to there. If you tell us that you have something, we just take it and we call it a day. All is good. But if you pretend that you don't have anything, then it costs a whole lot of money. So my parents, because they were driving with an RV, they got searched because these RVs always get searched with dogs and stuff and whatever, and they completely forgot about them. So at the moment when they were there, they were like, oh my God, we did not know that this, or we did not think about that this happened, but luckily they got rid of everything beforehand. So if you drive to Amsterdam and come back to Germany, don't take stuff, otherwise you have issues. Consume it all right there.
What's the fine? Is it a fine or is it like straight fine or something?
No, I don't. Well, I guess it depends a little bit on the amount that you have. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't do that stuff, so I have not really an idea about how the legal system there is. Okay, so did we all download that bottle? Good. Then let's open up a new scene in Cinema 4D. Just hit Command N. In there, we want to jump to the front view. So we click again on the tiny icon in the top right corner. And then that is the top view, so we go down to the front view and click on the same icon there to open it back up. Then we want to go to the viewport settings. I always remember like V for viewport, so I hit Shift V. Alternatively, if you are smarter than me, you can go to, I already forgot, Options and then Configure. Yeah. Then we have a couple of tabs here, and we want to switch to the back tab. By the way, Cinema 4D can show multiple tabs at the same time. So when you hold down Command, you can, no, Shift, you can open up multiple tabs underneath each other, and sometimes it gets stuck, so there are multiple there, then things get weird. Just click on another tab that was not selected, and then you can kind of like only have that tab shown. Sometimes it's nice that multiple tabs are active, sometimes irritating. So we go to the back tab, to the image, and we click on the dot, dot, dot. There, we'll then choose our image. And because it's usually a little bit too bright and it interferes with the other elements that we have on top, we change the transparency and just drag the value up until it is like this. Bless you. Then we zoom into the top, and we want to use our pen tool. In the pen tool, we switch the type to B-spline, and we start creating points.
What's the difference between spline pen and spline arc?
This one and this one alters a spline that you already have. So when you have a couple of points, for instance, especially here with a sketch, where I do something like this, I have a high density of points, which makes it kind of hard to adjust it. I've never really used it, but I think here, if we also have the smooth, for instance, I draw over this path and it smooths out the path, and the arc also does something like this, where it just smooths out the stuff that I already have. Yeah, I've never tried it. Let's see. Here.
So it only deals with the point.
Yeah, it somehow deals with the points. But I've never used the arc, so I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to do. Oh, here. When I have multiple ones selected. Oh, now it creates weird shapes, things. Oh, okay. So I can create fancy arcs like that. And then create another one. Ooh, fancy. I would not know when I would ever use that. But it's
Textures, yeah, sculpturing your interior design.
It's interesting. Maybe someday. Okay, so we start with the regular pen tool, and we use the B-spline as the type. And we start by clicking pretty close to the center. We don't have to be like too picky about it. We will use values to align it later on anyways. Then whenever we have a corner, we use 3 dots, like this. And when we want to end the shape, we hit Escape.
Oh, in the middle we end the shape.
Yes. Don't go back, because otherwise you get a closed path. And if that then revolves around, then it's kind of like these things that women put in their hair to have like a ponytail, but the thick ones. They will look kind of like that. So, no, not a, well, it also almost looks like a dot.
How do you end the like?
Hit Escape.
How do you make the
You should have stand here somewhere with your little line.
how do you make the curve straight? Because like for example, after the angle it gets curved. And then I want it to be straight again, you know? So
Let me. Alrighty. Now for the top part here, we want to be picky. For the bottom parts, not so much. And we want the top and the bottom to be perfectly aligned. To do so, we will go to our live selection. And we click and drag across the top 3 points. Then when we look down here, we can see, in my case, they have a height, so the size, of 1.415 centimeters. So they are not perfectly aligned. I simply delete this value. You don't even have to type in 0. Just delete it, hit enter, and then they will be perfectly aligned. We will then do the same thing with the bottom ones as well. Clicking across them to select them, getting rid of the Y value for the size, hit enter, and they are perfectly aligned. And lastly, we will do the same thing again for the center elements, but these ones should be aligned along the x-axis. So both the position x and the size x should be 0. And then everything is perfectly aligned. Then we just continue. We create another spline. To create a new one, make sure that the old one is not selected. Otherwise, you add something to the same spline. It's kind of like in Photoshop when you have one shape layer, but multiple shapes inside of it. We don't want that. We want a different element for each one. So don't have the spline selected, go back to the spline pen, double checking, B-spline, all is good. And then we just start creating a new shape here.
But you start a little bit inside the
Yeah.
It's just cute. Chill in the back seat.
That's cute, so yeah. Just in case you forgot it. And we do the same with the access factor.
Here, I don't care so much about the bottom part because I won't see it anyways. And there I want to make sure that this one dot here in the middle is exactly in the middle. Also, it doesn't matter that much for this specific part of the shape, but it doesn't hurt to be a little bit more accurate.
So the position should be 0.
Yeah. And then we just repeat the same thing again. Select the tool, have no spline selected, and we create some new points here. So for the last object at the very bottom, also make sure that the dot is exactly in the center. So now we have something that looks like this. Now that we switch to the perspective view, we can add our lathes. So we go to the extrude and we create a lathe. And we just go to the extrude and we create another lathe. And then we go to the extrude again and create yet another lathe. The reason is that the lathe only allows a single element to be inside, so I cannot put multiple elements inside. It doesn't work, it only accepts the first one. Also, we want 3 different objects anyways, with 3 different materials. Okay, so in theory it's just 2 different materials, but still. So we just drop then our splines into the respective lathe, and we then have our geometry. Ta-da! Bless you. So far, so good? Now, the nice thing about this is that this is super editable. So this lathe is very quickly in calculating the geometry, which means if I select, for instance, this part here, and I'm like, maybe I want to add like a super creative curve, I just use my live selection to select a point, and then I just move this point around. And therefore, I then adjust this to whatever shape I want. So just the live selection and move points around. Just make sure that you rather do it on one axis at a time, or, little tip, take a quick look here. I can move it on one axis at a time, or if I hover over this triangle thing, you can see how 2 axes are highlighted. The ones that are not the color of the triangle. So when I hover over the blue triangle, I don't move it along the z-axis. So I can easily move it in on a 2D plane independent from my camera. And then I can just adjust the shape to whatever I want. Using the live selection, and make sure that you have the spline selected that you want to alter. So spline needs to be selected, point mode needs to be active, then I can see the points, I can select them and just move them around and do whatever I want to.
What is the difference of the picture?
I'm in the perspective view. I don't have a picture there.
So when you render this,
Mm-hmm.
it won't render, right? The picture doesn't render when you do it.
No, this renders.
No, I mean the image that's at the back.
Oh yeah, the image doesn't render. It's just a background thing for the orthographic views. It's not in the perspective view. Mm-mm. So far, so good?
And whenever you want to add, like, are we allowed to do that on the 3D side if you want to add an image? Or we do that when you're on Photoshop, like you told us to do it?
Depends a little bit on what you want to do.
I don't know.
Of course, you are allowed to add an image here. You could use an image to wrap around to, for instance, like if you want, when it was shipped, there was like this paper ribbon thing around it. There, I would create separate geometry for it. So it's kind of like adding an image that I just wrap around it. Or
texture and import an image instead of a color.
exactly. Or another option is that we could take, for instance, a picture of a table, and we can use the picture of the table as a background and place the bottle on there, and then render it as if it's standing in the picture that we've taken.
And how do we,
So won't that distort it, trying to wrap it?
There are ways that it doesn't do that.
how do you import an image then if you want to use it as a background or something?
We will talk about it in another class. A couple of more things need to be considered then. Alrighty, so far so good? Great. Now I'll show you how we can use what we've done in our previous project and use it here. I'll do it very quickly, afterwards we do it together. Just take a look. I go back to my scene that I've built previously and I'm like, I like my background and I do like my light setup. So I select the plane and the other elements up to the sky. So sky, lights, plane, and I just copy that one. I hit V, switch back to my project here, and I just hit Command V to paste. Now I have my same lights, my same backdrop, everything in here, and I simply take my lathe and maybe I drop it into null object. However, and then it's kind of tricky to place it exactly on the floor. It's nicer if my null object is not in the center of the object, but at the bottom of it. So for this, I will switch to my front view, I have my null object selected, so I can move it down, down, and then I just zoom in quite close, and I adjust it until it looks like it's pretty much sitting on the bottom of the bottle, like this. Then I can take all of my bottle elements, and I drop them inside of the null. If I now move it upwards, or if I just go to the model mode, change the position to 0, it now sits nicely on my table. And I can also, from here on, just scale it down.
Why again was it now necessary to make it a null object? Why was it now important to make it a null object instead of just moving to a different...
Because now I can say that my axis is in the bottom. Otherwise, with my lathe, all the axes are in the center here. So also when I now scale it, it scales towards the center, then I need to adjust the position again, and that's kind of annoying. Also, it looks a whole lot cleaner if I can say bottle, and I don't have these 3 separate elements there. So a null object is usually there to make your life more organized and convenient. And now I just zoom in, angle it the way that I want to, and when I render, ta-da! It's directly in there without having to waste much time. Alrighty, let's now. Silver is an advanced material. We will talk about it in our next session. Okay, so let me just undo a couple of steps. We start by going back to our previous project, which is probably still open. So you hit V, go to projects, and to the previous one. We then want to select the sky, the lights, and the plane. Hit Command C to copy. V to switch again to our new project. And Command V to paste it in there. So usually this then means that our bottle is kind of like cut off by the floor. Because we know that our studio has a proper size, we don't want to move the studio down and do weird stuff. We just say no, like in the real world, we just place this in the studio where it's supposed to be, and not the other way around. So we just go to the cube here, click and drag to create a null. Then we go to our front view, zoom in a little bit, and we take the null object and we just move it down until it is kind of at the bottom of the bottle. So when we zoom out, we should have our bottle and the null object should be nicely at the bottom of it. Are we good? Great. Now we can take all the bottle elements, so the lathe with the splines, and we drop them into the null object. Now we can also close the null and call it bottle, so it's a little bit cleaner. And then we simply go back to our perspective view, make sure that we are still in the model mode. We have the bottle null object selected, and we change the position Y to 0. So now the bottle should stand nicely in the center here. Now we simply go to the scale tool and scale the bottle down. Make sure that you don't scale only one axis, otherwise you start to stretch it, and we cannot revert this. We can undo it, but later on we can only eyeball it to roughly get it back to the original shape. So make sure that you don't click on an axis, just click in an empty area as you scale this to the proper size. Ta-da! And then you render. Are we good? Good. Then let's take a very short intermission just to get our heads clean, and then we will fly through the next two ones. They're a lot simpler than what we've done before.
Should we elaborate this or?
Nah. This is just for us to test. We don't really need a final result out of this. This is just practice. So 5 minutes, so we see each other. I wanted to say 10 past, so it's now 12 past. And then I want to continue, okay? The next one, we will just kind of like model. I don't care about putting it into the setup because by now we know how we can put something into our setup and we're good. So the next one is this glass. I think you have seen glasses like this a lot where they have kind of like one shape at the bottom, but then at the top it's a different one. So for this we use the loft. And there we think about extrudes, but multiple extrudes. So an extrude only accepts one input, and it just extrudes it in different directions. But the loft connects multiple shapes and blends from one to the other. Just like the blend function in Illustrator. Have you ever used it? So this here works exactly the same, but in 3D. So just to show a very simple example, I could say I start, oops, not with a formula. I could say I start with a flower, and then I want it to be a circle in the end, like this. I could then take the loft, put two elements inside of it, and I can now see if I increase my subdivisions here, it is morphing from one shape to the other here. Make sense? So it does exactly the same as the blend does, but it does it in 3D and with a whole lot of lines that are being, well, morphed. I could then also say I want another flower. Maybe I put it at the top, so the order here is important. And then like this. And then it goes from one to the other. Maybe I also want it to twist at the same time, so I just rotate this around a little bit. Maybe I also add another one. And maybe I also rotate it around like that. And move it up. So I have no idea what the shape is supposed to be, but you kind of like get the idea. We have different, we kind of like create this cage like this. And then this cage is connected or wrapped in geometry. And this is basically what I did there. So I started out with an N side. I gave it 8 sides, and I changed the plane on which it lies on X and Z because I was too lazy to rotate it. Then I just duplicated it up once, maybe twice, close, twice. Then I added a circle. Same thing, just changed the axis and I moved it upwards. And then maybe also 2 of them or whatever. So now I've created this cage, and then I drop it into the loft. The order of this is important because it will start with this element and it will connect it to the next one and to the next one. So if I change the order of things like this, then suddenly everything is kind of like messed up and going into one another. So Cinema is not smart and detects this is on top of the other and goes up and down. We have to tell it this is the first, next one, next one, next one, next one, next one. Then I see, okay, so maybe the resolution here is not good enough. So I go to the loft and it's the mesh subdivision U. And I just increase it until I have enough segments until it looks decent. I don't like, however, how the N side has these really sharp edges. They don't look well with this. So I go to the rounding, I enable it, and I go to a rounding of maybe 20 or something. Now the loft, unfortunately, doesn't really blend it together so nicely, so I first increase maybe my subdivisions a little bit further, and I realize that my circles are apparently rotated differently than the N side now because of the rounding. Not quite sure why that happens, but the solution is just selecting the circles and rotating them around 10 degrees until they look nicely aligned. So when I now go to display, go rotating, I've created this nice typical shape that we know many glass bottles have. Okay? If I then want to give this some thickness, there are a couple of different things that can be done. The most easy solution right now would be to just go to the loft, go to the caps and tell it that it should not have caps. So it's opened at the bottom and the top. Just ignore that it's also open at the bottom. We'll talk about it some other time. There are solutions, but it's messy. So we have this, and I want to give this a little bit of thickness. So I would go to the subdivision surface, and I choose the cloth surface, and I just drop it into the cloth surface. By default, the cloth surface subdivides the element and tries to make it look more like cloth. So if it already has wrinkles, it tries to emphasize them. I don't have wrinkles, so I don't want anything there. I do, however, want to give it a little bit of thickness. So I do that to give it some thickness here. Then if I want this to be rounded as well, I just add a subdivision surface that just blurs everything, and then I have a nice thick shape here. If I then go to my display, rotating with lines, I can see if I select the second to last circle and I move it up and down, I can kind of like define how smooth or sharp I want these corners to be. Without the lines, it looks like this. So either I have a very smooth way on this edge, do you see it? It's very smooth. Or if the two circles are closer to one another, it is a much sharper edge. So here they are very close together, like this. And when they are further apart, it gets blurred further down. Okay, let's do this together. And pretend that it has a bottom. But then again, on this picture, did you know that this didn't have a bottom? I think you didn't. So just like with the character where we had the eyes on the back, there are always solutions to fix these things. But like sometimes it's just, if it's not necessary, don't waste time. Okay, so we start with a new scene. We start with a new scene, and we start by creating an N side. Underneath the pen, underneath the pen, and then it's the N side. Because it has an N amount of sides. You know? So here we will give it 8 sides. And we already know that we want it a little bit rounded. So we enable the rounding and maybe give it a radius of 20. We also know that it should point up and down. So we go to the plane and change the axis to X and Z. So 8 sides, radius of 20, plane X and Z. Good? Good. Now we want a copy of that. So we hover over the y-axis, make sure you're in the model mode, move tool, all good. Hold down the control key and just drag it upwards a little bit. So we create 2 copies of it. We can always adjust the distance between them later on. Right now we're just guessing. So far so good? Next, we will create a circle. Here, the only thing that we change is the plane to X and Z. We move it even higher up and create 2 more copies. So we have 3 circles and 3 end sides, all in the correct order underneath one another. Where the end side was.
How do we make sure that the distance between them is equal, or we don't? Just
I don't care. Are we good? Next, we just create the loft. And we grab all of our elements and we drop them into the loft. And we should see something kind of like this. So we see I guess the shape is kind of there, it's just not that pretty yet. So far so good? Loft, and just drop everything in there. Now in order to see where the loft creates its edges, it's best to change our mode up here, display, to garage shading lines. And then it should look like this. And we can see, okay, so there's some rotation issues.
Did you have 3 circles or 2 circles?
3. 3 of each. Could also work with 2. I think with 3 we have the most control. Thank you. You know, I really try. All right. Next, we want to add a couple of more subdivisions so we can see the curvature here a little bit better. So we go to the loft and to the object settings, and I can tell you it's the mesh subdivision U. As we increase this, we can see, okay, so I guess I just need to rotate it slightly. So we select, just increase it to 150 or something. Then we go to the circles, we select all 3 of them, hit R for the rotation tool and rotate it around the y-axis. I don't really have a correct value. I'm guessing it's around 10 degrees. But I don't know. But now it looks good, so I'm fine. So far, so good? Good. Now that this looks nice, we can go back to our display and regular garage shading, and we can play around with the distance between our end side, the last one, and the first circle. So by changing the distance, we change where this transition happens. Make sure that you don't overlap 2 elements because then weird stuff is happening. So always be aware of where these elements are. Maybe turn off the loft once in a while to double check that you don't have any interferences. Now in order to give this glass a little bit of a thickness, we will go to the loft, go to the caps, and turn off both the start cap and the end cap. Now, of course, you could say, but Leonard, why are you doing that? I mean, you could just leave the end cap and then you have a bottom. Yeah, I could do that. However, the way that the loft is connecting the elements together, if I then add the thickness with the cloth surface, my bottom looks really fucked up. So I just don't. So loft, caps, and turn off start and end cap. Then we will create a cloth surface, and we drop the loft inside of the cloth surface. In the cloth surface, we will go to the subdivision and change it to 0. And the thickness, I don't know, I don't care, just something so it's thicker. So in my case, 15, maybe that's a bit thick. It's fine. Lastly, we add a regular subdivision surface and drop the cloth surface into the subdivision surface, and then we have our nice thick bottle glass thing with a rounding here. There are always ways, but not today. Okay. Are we good? Good. Then let me talk about the last one. So here I'm not going to even bother putting up any lights there because we know how that shit works. You lost your what? So here we have multiple elements. It might happen that at some point I accidentally move one to the side. I could of course do this on purpose. I could also do that kind of like on accident. What you can do is you can double check what the values for the other circles are. So when I compare it, here I have my coordinates and I go to one of my circles, I can see perfectly aligned on the x and the z axis and only moved along the y axis. Then I just go to the circle that is out of order and I'm like, okay, so probably these just need to be 0 and I'm good. So unfortunately, we don't really have alignment tools. We can scale stuff, but this, of course, we don't want to scale. Just want to change the position. And then we just usually compared with other elements. One of the reasons why it's so important to build something exactly in the center, because if everything is built a little bit outside of the center, so my loft is perfectly centered, you can see here, the loft is centered, but my elements are not. If I now try to compare these values, they just look really random, and I have to go through and I'm like, okay. So I would then have to copy paste these things over, and then things get hard.
You select all of them and then insert the value, do all of them change?
Yes. So if I select all of them here, I could go in here, type in 0, 0, and then it's perfectly aligned in the center again. Okay. So now for the last project. You take a look here. I do first. Afterwards, we will do it quickly together. I create a new scene, and I want some character there. So just to remind us what it looks like, this is it. So I create a character by going through MoGraph and use the MoText. There's a reason why MoText is part of the Clone family. I'll talk about it some other time. So I have my text here. I will choose something simple like in R. I will use a bold font, and I will align it to the middle, and then have a good starting point here. By the way, when working with these letters, you can also go to the caps and create some interesting effects. For instance, in the cap, I could say that I don't want it to be rounded, but it could be a curve. Then I can increase the size. Okay, I increase the size a lot larger, like 5. You can see how I then get this cap thing, and because I told it to be a curve, I get a curve down here where I could just add a point and change the curve. You can see how I'm now getting this really nice and fancy indented corner there. I even have selections. However, I've not used them yet. Oh, here they are. Start bevel and end bevel. So R1 and R2. Which means that I could now create a material, just to show you really quickly. So you've seen it. Maybe the body is white. And then another material is maybe, let's make it pink and see what happens. It will probably look awful. So there I have my material, and the material has a field that is called selection. Now because I added the selection, I now have a selection tag here. And I just drop it in there, and I want to use the other one. Oops, damn it. And then I have a different material for the bevel that I have created. So R1 and R2 refer to the rounding 1 and rounding 2. I don't see the back, so again, I don't care. Okay, why did I use pink? I will just live with it. I commit. Okay, so next I will go to my front view, and I want to create this 3-dimensional path going around. So right now I can only draw it in 2D space, but in my mind I'm already imagining what's going to happen. So I take the B-spline, I'm like, okay, so I start like down here, and it's like behind. And then it comes through the hole to the front, then it's in the front, then it goes around it, then it's behind it, goes up to the front, back inside, and to the back. You feel me? Perfect. So I now hit escape because I'm done with this path, And obviously, this one here does not look like I did it. So it doesn't react to voice commands. Too bad. In the future, hopefully. Have you seen like when Adobe made like commercials for how they imagine Photoshop will be like in the future? And it would react to voice commands, and you had like old people sitting in front of it and saying stuff like, make my image friendlier. And then it just got brighter. It's like, wow. That was all you can think of to tell us what the future is. Crazy. Okay, so I use my point selection, and I just select the points where I know that they will be in the back. So I know this is in the back, definitely, and I know that probably these two are in the back, and maybe that one is kind of like in between, I don't know yet. So something like that. So I go back to my perspective view, and I drag these points backwards. Then I will select the points that are definitely in the front, so this one, maybe these two, and then I drag them, damn it, and I drag them to the front. Now I go to my perspective view and I just start adjusting them. So I see like, okay, so here this curve looks weird, so I adjust it a little bit. This one here maybe needs to be pushed backwards a bit so I don't have any overlaps. Maybe yeah, what? Ooh, damn. But it saved it. Can I copy this? Oh my god, this is so hard. Let's see. Sometimes when cinema crashes, it very rarely happens, it saves the file for you. So it knows, I'm dead, but here's your file. Like, but why don't you just now not be dead? I mean, you had time to do stuff. So what is the issue? Okay, I need to go to my Finder. Let's see if I can find it. User, where's my user? User. Data roaming. No, where? App data roaming. Maxon. Cinema 4D. Bug reports. No, the other one. Bug reports. I don't see a recovery. Ah, there we go. Perfect. Oh my god, it saved even all of the scenes that it opened. That's beautiful. Okay, so let me just open it back up. Yeah, come on. Cinema 4D. Okay. There's a problem. Wait, do I have to move it over? Why? Oh, wait, sorry. There we go. Done. So sometimes it's nice that stuff like this exists, but most of the time it doesn't happen. Okay, so I have this, and I just continue looking at the points that I have and reconsidering where in 3D space I put them. And at this point you realize, yeah, that's why we use B-splines. Because if I had tangents, I would have to constantly adjust the rotation, look at it from so many different angles. And here I can just be like, I just have a point, and I just move the point around until the path looks nice and round. And it's so much easier. If I would have to do that with a Bezier, it would take until tomorrow. Now that I have my basic shape here, I will only do the one because we then get how it works. I will use the sweep. I drop this spline inside and nothing happens. The reason is the sweep needs 2 inputs. By the way, you can kind of like see what inputs they need by looking very closely at the icons. So this one input, 1 white spline. This one input, 1 white spline. This one, many inputs, multiple splines. This one, 2 inputs, 1 spline for the path and 1 spline for the profile. Totally smart. So we need a second one, and that is the profile. And this can be any path that we want. It could be an open one, it could be a closed one. I will not use the helix, that doesn't really make much sense, but I could use the circle and just drop it inside. Then sometimes this happens. The reason is that I have a huge circle that is then moved around this tiny spline. So I take this circle and go to my model mode, and I just scale it down. You can imagine it kind of like a brush. So the circle is your brush, and the spline is the path that you painted across, just in 3D space. I could also use something else. For instance, I could use the flower. I just drop it inside. Let me get rid of the circle and make the flower a little bit smaller. And I can see how it uses the flower to drag it across it. So this is literally what it does. Takes a shape and it moves it across. So let me just drop this back in here, get rid of the flower. In the sweep, we also have an advanced option, which is kind of cool, by going to the details and to the scale. Here we see this kind of like curve that we saw earlier for the edge of the text. Whenever we have something like this, it's a spline as well, we hold down Command to add new points. So here I can then move it around. These are always Bezier paths, but I can then just change this path around and therefore define how the thickness of my stroke should be. So in the beginning, the scale is little. In the middle, the scale is larger. It could also be more in the beginning or more at the end. This looks really creepy. And this is then the size of the end. So like this, I can kind of like design this. Then, lastly, for the texture, I simply created a luminance material. In the luminance, I went to the Fresnel, and for the inside, I chose white. For the outside, I chose kind of like a bluish color, very bright, something like that. And I apply it to the sweep. So I already get this feeling of it kind of like glowing from the inside and having a specific color. And that's it. And when I render it, this will be used as my light source. Ta-da! Exactly. Because in our render settings, we use global illumination. And whenever we have a luminance material, that will be used to light up things. Okay, let's do it together. We start with a new scene. And we want to create a character. So we go to MoGraph, or the cloner here, and we choose MoText. In the MoText, we will go to our text input field. We just use a simple letter like R. I recommend using a bold font, and it should be middle of line. San Francisco is the default system font. So every font that you see in your OS, like the font of the menu, the font of the Finder text, that's San Francisco. So far, so good? Good. All right. Next, we want to add a little bit of a rounding to this, just to make it look more fancy. So we go to MoText, go to Caps. We increase the size to something like 5. The default rounding is just a rounded edge, but this doesn't really look fancy. I mean, it's something, but it's not what I'm looking for. I want something intense. So above the size, we will go to the bevel shape and change it from round to curve. Then we just hold down Control or Command, click on the path to add another point, and just drag it to the bottom right corner And then we get this nice, interesting shape there. And of course, you can play around with the tangents in here to adjust this curve to however you like. If you want more details, you need to go a little bit further down to the segments and increase the amount of segments that you have. Then you have a little bit more control over the shape here. I would just want this tiny edge. There we go. So you could also create something like this. Not quite sure why, but I can. Yeah, this is my shape now. This is awesome. Completely useless, but it's there. So far, so good? Next, we will go to our front view. In there, we then start by using the pen tool and changing the type to B-spline. When we now create our points, we already think in our head where we want stuff to go. So we make sure that we have points to move forward and backwards. So this point will be in the back. This one kind of like in the middle, going to the front. Definitely in the front. On its way back, in the back. Still in the back. Maybe already going a little bit forward. Definitely forward. Maybe going down already a little bit. Going further back. All the way in the back. You don't have to create exactly the same points as me. But try not to use too little or too many points. So roughly the amount of points that we see here could be your orientation. If you have twice as many, then you just make your life harder than it needs to be. If you have only half as many, the shape might look the same, but we have less control over where stuff goes to the back and where stuff goes to the front. Do we all have a shape like this?
Yes.
Perfect. Next, we just go to our 3D view, to the overview, because in our perspective view, it's kind of hard to select points if they are inside of our geometry. So we usually use the orthographic view in order to select the points that we want to move. And then we use the perspective view to move them where we want them to be. So these should be in the back. These maybe only halfway back. No, just only move one axis at the same time. Then this and this, and this probably in the front. So this just takes some getting used to, moving around the scene, constantly reevaluating where you want to place your points, maybe also move some stuff up and down again in order to create a nicer, rounder shape. So far, so good? Almost. We can always fine-tune the shape a little bit later, so let's just keep it the way that it is and add the sweep. To do so, we click and drag onto our extrude and we choose the sweep. We already know that the sweep needs 2 inputs, so we go to the pen tool and we choose a circle. For the sweep, the order is important, so we first need to have the circle on top and the spline underneath it. The spline, however, cannot be a child of the circle, then it will not work. So, circle and spline cannot be parents and children, they have to be siblings. Like this. Then usually the circle might be way too large, so you just see the circle and nothing else. Just go to the model tool, scale tool, click anywhere, and click and drag to the left, and it should just scale down until it has a proper size. Lastly, I want the sweep to be a little bit better in the design, and for that we will go to the Object tab. In the Object tab of that sweep, we will go down and we open up the details. In the details, we then should see a scale and a graph in there. And we can see a spline like point 1 and point 2. In the middle, we want to add a third point. Hold down the Control or Command key and click. Then you can drag down the left and the right. And then you should see how your path has different thicknesses. Doesn't matter. And you only do it to create the additional point, not to move the other ones. Alrighty. The material then is just a Fresnel, so nothing new. I think we don't have to repeat that part together, but feel free to do it now if you want to. For the homework for next week, the more and more we go into the future, the more and more specific my assignments will get. So, I want you to use at least 2 of the things that we've learned today. So, this also includes the extrude. So, extrude, lathe, loft, sweep, and the volume builder. 2 of them should be used in order to create one object. And that object should be something that you find in your kitchen. In Hamburg, I told them to use the bathroom, but then people had really weird grins on their faces, so I was like, what do you have in your bathrooms? So, for you guys, you will get the kitchen. So just take a look at things that you have. Obviously, not every object can be recreated with the techniques that we have here, but there are a lot of different things that can be created. So maybe not something as complex like a fork. Because a fork, if I think about the techniques that we have, it's really hard. Like, it is possible, but really hard. But like a knife can work. It can consist of 2 parts. Or, well, different kinds of cups. Or maybe we have like a plate, although then you only have 1 technique. Maybe you put something on the plate or use a different technique. So 2 techniques or 2 containers that we talked about today. 1 object, and that object is supposed to be in our nice studio setup. Oh. In the end, I want you to render out a PNG. You can, if you want to, edit it in Photoshop. It's encouraged, but not necessary for this assignment here. And one thing that you should be aware of, if we have the setup, where's the folder with the, I closed it, that doesn't matter. When we have the setup with our backdrop and such, do not render it out and let me see the background. So let me just open one of my other files where I do have a background in there. Like, yeah, the extrude, doesn't matter. It's thinking. So if this is the setup, it's still thinking. This is the setup. Do not render it out like this. I mean, if you take a picture of something in a studio, you would not include the ugly background with other things in there. So for 3D, the same. If you have the studio set up and you want to render out a project that is lit in there, make sure that you only take a picture like this, also not like this. I will be really mad at you if I see that. Okay. Are we good? Nice. Then have a nice weekend and see you next week.